I spend hours every week digging through 18th century cookbooks, and you would think that one of the most common recipes that you would find over all of these cookbooks would be chicken soup, something that's so common today you could find it in any cookbook you'd like. But in the 18th century, there is a single one recipe that's titled a chicken soup. It's that soup time of year. You know, it's getting cold outside, and maybe we've got a cold and we want something medicinal like chicken soup. And in the 18th century, they certainly thought chicken soup or chicken broth was a very medicinal kind of thing to eat. They would have recipes in the actual medical books of the time period. Now, sometimes they would call them chicken broth or even a viper broth that would be mostly chicken broth with a snake thrown in. Don't ask me why they thought that was medicinal, but they did. Now, our recipes in the 18th century, we've got lots and lots of soups, mainly just kind of general soup recipes or fish soup recipes. But just when we want to find that chicken soup recipe, it's not there. Now, it might be there if we look at those general soup recipes, and it turns out those general soup recipes are very complex. And we did a soup a couple of weeks ago or last month that you could see the complexity of it. It's got greens, it's got multiple kinds of meats. We boil it for quite a long time. And if we keep reading in those recipes, we find at the very end that we're supposed to put a boiled chicken right into the middle of that soup and serve it that way. This soup is actually a lot like that, but it's titled chicken soup and it's got a little bit more chicken broth in it than a typical just generic soup recipe of the time period. So we're gonna work on this complicated soup recipe and see how it turns out. Now, it's got some real problems with it, and we'll talk about that as we go along. Some kind of sticking points where we really have to dig into this recipe and interpret it. It's not like a modern recipe where everything is worked out for us and all the measurements are there. We've done hundreds of recipes here on the channel, and yet we have never used this particular recipe book before. This one's A Lady's Assistant in the Economy of the Table by Anne Batham, and it's done in 1759. So it's a fairly early or right in the middle of the 18th century. To make chicken soup, take 2 chickens, fill them with a good forcemeat, and put them into a small pot. Throw over them as much veal broth as you think will fill your soup dish. Then take some young leeks, parsley roots, and celery. Tie them in a bunch and put them in the pot with your chickens and some pieces of fresh meat, either beef or mutton. To make your broth strong, put in mace and salt and whole pepper. Then take lettuce and a little spinach and sorrel, about a handful in all. Give them 1 scald in boiling water and salt. Then let the water run from them and stew them in a little butter for about 20 minutes. When they are tender, chop them small and put some of your chicken broth to them. Let them boil a small time together. Then beat the yolks of 3 or 4 eggs with a little of your broth. And when you have strained off your soup, thicken it up with them and pour it with your chopped herbs over the chickens. Wow, sounds very, very difficult. A lot of moving parts here to this recipe. You can kind of see that it's in 2 parts. We've got our chickens that we are going to boil in a broth with some of these herbs. And then we have this other section where we're going to take our greens and we're going to put them in water. We're going to wash them basically. Then we're going to cook them in a little bit of butter and then boil that kind of separately in a broth, and then later on pour that over the top. So we have this chicken that's boiled in the broth to bring out the flavor, but it's not even boiled in chicken broth. It's boiled in a veal broth or just a beef broth that we would use today. And it also has fresh meat. So what does she mean by this fresh meat? She means beef. So beef is in our chicken soup. So it's a very complex soup. To get started, we need to have the force meat to fill our bird. Our force meat is made with ground pork. We're gonna put a little bit of suet in there, which is hard beef fat. It's made with breadcrumbs and some salt and pepper. And we're gonna mix this up into a nice consistency and then fry it up. We're gonna pre-cook it because we get this big problem of having the force meat inside of our chicken. Now they may have put it in there raw, But how do you know whether it's going to get cooked to the center of it? You have no idea, and this is pork, so we're going to make sure to pre-cook that before we put it in a bird. Now, force meat's an odd term. You're not used to that concept, but basically it's a kind of a sausage. It means a chopped up meat that you would force into other kinds of meat as a stuffing. The recipe calls for us to put this chicken whole down in the pot. It's filled with our force meat, and now we're gonna put over it broth. And it calls for veal broth. We're gonna use a beef broth. We're gonna cover the bird up. Now this is the bulk of our soup. So we're gonna have a large quantity of broth that goes on here. We have recipes for broth themselves, but basically it's boil down that meat until you have a very, very thick broth. The recipe also calls for the meat, the fresh meat, which can be beef or mutton. Obviously, I've got beef here. We're gonna cut it into small pieces. We're gonna put it into the broth to cook along with the chicken. And it also calls for these vegetables of celery and leeks. Now, normally we would just chop these up and throw them in. This is talking about tying them up in a bundle and placing them in that we would take out later. The recipe doesn't actually say that, but that's generally what happens in these recipes. Sometimes we tie herbs up, and in this case, we tie these vegetables up. They will come out whole later on, so we don't have to strain them. We also have some spices that go in at this point, some salt, depending on how salty your broth is already, and some pepper and a little mace. And the mace can be whole. Again, that would be sort of strained out later on. If you really want to, you could substitute some ground nutmeg. Now we have a step in the recipe that is kind of off to the side. It's sort of like the second half of the recipe, where we take greens, in this case, spinach and lettuce. We're going to dip them or scald them in boiling water, and then we're going to fry them in butter. That will go in as a separate step. The recipe calls for thickening up the soup with eggs. Now, this is not a common thickener that we would use today, but it is the most common thickener that we would have in our time period. We're gonna whisk our eggs up and then temper them with a little bit of the soup. If we don't do that, if we just drop these eggs in, they will not thicken our soup. Instead, they will cook, and we will have little bits of basically scrambled eggs in our soup. We don't want that at all. If we slowly bring the heat in from the soup into our eggs, and then once that's kind of up to heat, then we can mix that in, and that will make a very nice thickener. This is something like how the soup would be served. A large tureen, this one probably should be even larger for the chicken here, but a large tureen with the soup, the chicken in the center, a little bit of garnish, and the real question is, how does it get served out? The force meat is still inside of the bird, and the bird is whole here. Now, it's likely that at the table, whoever's close to this particular dish would dish out some of the soup into the individual bowl and probably flake off little bits of the flesh of the bird, some of the breast meat or the leg meat, maybe even try to dish out some of the force meat and put it into each one of the bowls. So you can see this is an amazing soup. It's got beef broth in it, it's got beef in it, it's got pork in it, it's got the greens in it, and it does smell wonderful. And we're gonna go ahead and give this a little bit of a try so we can see how this soup turned out. And a very chickeny flavor. You would think this wouldn't have a lot of chicken flavor in it since it is basically cooked in beef broth, but we've got a wonderful mix of all these wonderful broth flavors together, along with that chicken in it, and excellent. Just, I mean, you could see some of these recipes, you would go ahead and have croutons, something else going along with your soup here. And of course, this is for a fairly high-end table. So this is just one of the many courses to a tremendous meal in the 18th century. We can imagine this on the table in the 18th century. So much different than what we would expect today, but amazing flavors, amazing tastes, and an amazing aroma.